Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 148, and we're going to talk about English requirements and immigration. So, I saw a post earlier today. I was going to talk about something else, but I saw this post and I thought, well, why not just talk about that today instead and let the other topic go for tomorrow? But should you be expected to speak English if you live in America? And I get this. I do. I grew up in America. My parents were not born here, but I was born here. Uh, and, I was harassed a lot as a kid, so I get it. I know that this is a natural phenomenon no matter where you go in the world. Some people might call it sort of racist, but as you all know, everything is racist. So it's not really a big deal that some people would think that it's racist or some people won't think that it's racist. It really doesn't matter. It only matters when you start passing legislation on what you think is and is not racist or what should be required. That's where the problem comes in. It's always going to be the legislation of morality. And, just to review what we had said before, the reason why this becomes a problem is that the legislation generally is written with a certain demographic group in mind without realizing that it would implicate and touch on other people uh, who the original legislators had no intention of affecting or to penalize or hurt in any way, but they get they get caught up in the mix, and that is the nature of racialization, race making, and legislation of morality. That is passing legislation based on your own subjective perspective. So I get it. I understand why those feelings occur, and we'll get to that in the end. But sort of let's get back and sort of flesh this out a little bit more. As I was growing up, and even now, I'll get looks from people for the lack of accent, right? So sometimes I'll interact with young Koreans, and since I don't have an accent at all, but their parents do, it's kind of weird for them. And I get that look. I know the look because I used to have that look when I would meet someone who spoke perfect English. But clearly, the ethnicity is not one that normally would associate with America. So back in the 70s through the 80s, you would always get this kind of, it would be pointed out, right, that your English is better than other people of your kind. You're somehow different, better than other people of your race. I went through the whole thing. At the same time, my parents wanted me to learn Korean. They were both extremely academically successful. If you know anything about Korea, it's all about studying. And if you're talented and gifted in studying, or you have an amazing superhuman level of perseverance, then you get to go to the elite schools of that country. And basically, your life is, qualitatively a lot better than other people who don't get to go to college, generally speaking. And obviously, even though my father went to, the elite school over there, Seoul National University, he came to America, got a PhD, and went into ministry. So obviously, wealth is not necessarily part of his game plan. And that's what I mean, generally speaking. So if he went into medicine or politics, then yeah, he'd be pretty wealthy. He would have been pretty wealthy anyway. But he realized very early in his life that English was really important. And so he would start studying English like crazy from the age of 6 or 7. And a lot of people probably would never believe that. It's impossible for someone that young to, commit to studying a different language as much as he did. But yeah, if you met my dad, if you knew him, then you'd realize, yeah, okay, I get it. He was one of those extremely precocious people, decided what he was going to do when he was 6 years old, and he got right to it. And so he everyone in the neighborhood in a very small town, which didn't have electricity, no running water, they called him English crazy, right? So, although he was English crazy, by the time he got here to the United States, and then we were all born here while he was doing his doctoral studies, he wanted us to remember where we came from, and so he wanted us to learn Korean. And so when we were at home, he would only speak to us in Korean, in spite of the fact that he could speak English fluently. He lectured in universities, right? He was a professor for a while, but he wanted us to know Korean as well. I hated it as a young child. I did everything to try to avoid it, do as little as possible, and that made me wonder, why was it that I had this attitude? Why was it that my parents were the way they were? Long story short, it led me to race studies as part of my doctoral training, and so part of my dissertation was to ask questions about immigration, like where did these attitudes come from, and the attitudes towards immigrants. And so I was examining these questions mostly with a mind to try to understand myself. Why did I have all this dysfunction in my family, in my head, and try to figure out a way out of it? Now, I already decided what the conclusion was going to be. It was something along the lines of my dad is wrong and I'm right, right? So I basically I got a PhD to try to prove my dad wrong. So it was a kind of a interesting thing to realize that there's no real wrong or right in the whole issue. There's just a lot of subjectivity. So anyway, in the process of studying this immigration, it wasn't comprehensive. It wasn't detailed because I only studied enough to get me to understand the racial dynamics that existed to try to understand contemporary times, right? Our present time. And a lot of people were coming to the United States. And so a lot of people and if you read the history books, you'll see that, it was tremendous, the number of people who were coming. And so the people who were living here felt threatened because they felt like they were getting outnumbered. And so in certain neighborhoods, you could see, yeah, there were more immigrants than there were people who were born in the United States. And so you see these communities in major cities, Little Italy, you know, Little Poland, all these different neighborhoods that were very much ethnically focused. The Irish had their neighborhood, etc. And so a lot of people don't know this, but a lot of the Irish didn't speak English; they spoke Gaelic, right? So a lot of people felt kind of angry, upset, afraid. They were afraid for their jobs. They were afraid that the kind of life that they enjoyed before was under threat. And so you had all these immigration laws, these sort of requirements for naturalization. And just sort of very briefly, you got to know that immigration, naturalization, INS related efforts started almost right from the very beginning in 1802. And all the way up to 1906, people were required to go through some sort of oral exam. Now, a lot of these were administered locally, right? So depending on where you ended up, your port of entry, the test could be radically different. And depending on the attitude of the person who was administering the test to you, because they were oral tests. If they didn't like you, then the test would be very tricky and hard. Obviously, it was always hard. So I guess if they didn't like you, the test would be even harder, right? So they were being gatekeepers to life in America. But in 1906, people realized that, hey, there's problems with this test. And so they took out a lot of the tricky questions. That was in the 1930s. But the Bureau of Naturalization tried to formalize a little bit more, bring some kind of structure starting in 1906. And in the 1930s, we see that the INS becomes even more prominent. And that is easily understood because the Federal Reserve was created in 1914, 1915, 1913, 1914. So therefore, you see the growth in government. And so now you can have these bureaucracies which grow ever larger. And so now they're able to somehow standardize and bring out some sort of formality, standardization in some of these processes. Nevertheless, you still don't see standard questions and you still don't see written exams even in the 1950s. So in the 1960s, that's when you begin to see some more standardization and sort of written exams, right? And that's because in 1964, they repealed the Johnson-Reed Act or the Immigration Act of 1924. Now, if you go to the early 1900s, you'll see that there are many, many immigration laws that were being passed. The 1924 Immigration Act was a quota based immigration restriction, right? So, based on the number of citizens in America already, that determined how many more people or newcomers from that particular country was allowed in the country that year. And obviously, Asians weren't allowed to have citizenship in the early 1900s. And so basically, the quota would have been zero. However, because you needed to hand out visas for the diplomatic corps, right, for ambassadors and foreign dignitaries and whatnot. So the limit was put to 30 per year, right? And so obviously they went at a premium. But in 1964, the Johnson-Reed Act was repealed. And so now you see a huge influx of immigrants, not from Europe, which is what they were hoping when they repealed it, but from Asia. You see a tremendous number, right? Hundreds of thousands of immigrants from Asia. And it makes sense because Europe was coming out of a lot of their poverty, whereas Asia was still in their poverty. They saw coming to America as opportunity. And so therefore they started to come. And so and then you see a resurgency in this idea of giving some sort of standardized naturalization exam. All right. So a lot of people today don't realize that the questions they're supposed to be about the Constitution, right? So a lot of before, because they were oral and depending on the temperament of the person giving you the test, uh, you know, it could go anywhere. The questions could come from any topic, any subject. Um, but they were always supposed to be about the Constitution. Do you understand freedom? Do you understand the laws of the land? And all through history, of course, you see people, demanding and wanting, desiring to have more requirements on that naturalization process. And so language would be one of them. I think I saw an article or a headline not that long ago that English finally was made the official language of the United States. You know what? I'm going to check that right now. Yeah, I just looked that up. The United States still does not require English nationally speaking, as the national language, right? There is nothing like that. Some local areas may have that, but as a whole, as a country on the federal level, there is no national language, okay? But a lot of people want it to be the national language, right? And so that post I saw today, yeah, it should be the requirement. But I was listening to Jocko. I don't know if you know him, but I guess he used to be a Navy SEAL and then a Navy SEAL instructor. And he was interviewing this guy, Johnny Kim, who I don't know if you know him, but he was also in the SEALs. I think he was a medic. The interview I first heard his name, they were snipers. And so I don't know if he was a sniper as well, but he was definitely a medic. And Jocko was his instructor when he was in SEAL training. But it turns out that Johnny Kim's parents were from Korea. I'm not exactly sure how good their English was, but clearly Johnny Kim himself had to, you know, live a similar life to what I did. I think, I'm pretty sure he's a lot younger than me. And so he might have had a better, easier time of it, especially since he was born in California. And there were so many more Asians there than they were in the East Coast where I grew up. And so it's a different experience when you're in a place where it's so rare to see people who look like you versus a place where there are a lot of people like you. Anyway, but supposing that Johnny Kim's parents did not know English all that well, then they wouldn't have been allowed to live here, and then Johnny wouldn't have been born. Now, Johnny himself, I don't know if you know him, but he spells his name Jonny Kim, Johnny Y. Kim. He was a SEAL. I don't know exactly. Maybe a sniper, maybe a medic. Then he went to medical school, and he also became an astronaut with NASA. So very, very accomplished, multi-talented. I mean, I only saw like a minute or two of the Jocko interview, which I saw after I saw that meme and decided on this episode topic. But he's a serious dude. I mean, you can just the first impression you get of him is that this guy is not fake in any way. So hats off to him. Very much a decorated ex-military person, and I'm sure he's a genius doctor, and he's an astronaut to boot. I mean, come on, he's living the dream, right? But all of that would not have been possible if his parents didn't know how to speak English and therefore were not allowed to live here. So English shouldn't be the requirement or the way of determining if someone is going to be eligible to live here. I responded to that meme by saying, there are a lot of people who speak English and they hate America, right? I mean, seriously, you're going to kick people out whose grammar is atrocious, but you're going to allow people who hate the very fiber of this country. They get to live here. That's weird. I don't know. That doesn't seem like it's a great requirement or condition of residency here in America. So I offered as a alternative in my dissertation as well as afterwards that the requirement for living here in America is independence and self-sufficiency, right? If you can make a living, right, without requiring welfare or anything else, some social program, like you can get a job, you can pay your bills, you can support your family, hey, then that's really all you need. Because in order to be able to do that, you kind of have to believe in the system that we have here in the United States. And in the 1970s and 80s, when Koreans started coming into this country, I saw what they had to do to be able to get by. And they did anything, right? Wherever there was an opportunity for employment, they would do it. Excuse me, they would teach themselves to do it. Because let's face it, not everyone is gifted with language skills, right? So some people can study English really, really hard and they can't learn it. But other people, like my mom, how long has she been living here? And she really, English it's a challenge for her. And she's a woman, and women are supposed to be better at learning languages than the men, right? So my dad, he freely moved in and out of the Korean world, the English world. But my mom, she struggled with English, right? I mean, she could get a job, she could work, but she's not fluent by any stretch of the imagination. But, she's living here in America. And so it shouldn't be, language shouldn't be the requirement, but it's, can you be independent? Can you make a living? Can you support your family? Right? That should be more of the requirement. Like I knew a guy, he had an elementary school education, if that, came to America, sold $5 handbags on the streets, right, in the city, and he was making $300,000 a year in the 1980s. And so $300,000 a year in the 1980s is it's a lot. It's before all the inflation that we have today, and so obviously he was making a lot of money selling $5 handbags. But you got to understand, the hours were long, the weather conditions were brutal. He's on the street with his wife. I mean, come on, it's rough living, right? And so how the occupations, right? So not being able to speak English means that your job prospects, like where can you find employment, is restricted, right? It's reduced. You don't have a lot of choices. And look at Johnny Kim. He could speak English fluently, and he did everything. He was in the military. He was in the space program. He was in med school. I mean, man. I mean, he has lots of choices. He could have pretty much done anything that he wanted. Okay. And so that's the difference. Your language ability either reduces the choices, the employment choices that you have, or it expands them. Okay. Now, the thing is, and so I hope that resolves that for some people. But the attitudes we wrestle with, I mean, that's the result of social dynamics. And that's why I totally get it. I don't hold it against other people because that's just their living situation, right? So earlier in the early 1900s, that xenophobic, that fear or hatred of the outsider was because of the job competition, right? So you have all these people coming in, they're different from you, they're doing things differently, and somehow they're doing it better than you. They take your jobs, they put you out of business, they start new companies, they start producing different things that people like even more. And all of a sudden, you're out of a job. Now your company goes bankrupt, right? And so you are very, very upset. And so this happens for a lot of people. So the more successful they become, imagine this guy barely speaks English. He's making $300,000 a year. Yeah, he hardly ever sees his kids. Yeah, he has a lot of health issues, right? Because no matter how hot it is, no matter how cold it is, he's got to be out there 14, 16 hours a day selling $5 handbags. Okay, that's what it takes to make that kind of money. But that's not what most people see. What they see is a guy moving into their neighborhood who can barely speak English, and he seems to be living as well as me. How they do that, uh, you know, that's not fair, right? And so today we see the same emotions, but it's a result of, hey, they're not here legally, right? Now I have to deal with them. So what condition, what kind of requirement can I establish that would get rid of all of them? So we have all of these feelings and attitudes. We can't help but have them until we learn more, until we interact more, and until we understand more, right? So everyone has to remember that the life they live is a result of the choices that they've made in the past based on the knowledge that they've had in the past. And the great thing about America is that you can change. You don't like what's going down right now in your life, change, do something different. If you don't like being a Navy SEAL anymore, go to NASA, go to med school. That's the freedom that we can have in a free society. So as far as people coming to this country to live, you got to make them realize it's respect for the law. That's what the original naturalization exam was all about. Do you know the Constitution? Do you understand freedom? Do you understand property rights? Right. And so in that mix, a culture will develop, right? So people who come from different countries, there is a price to maintain the cultural practices of the old world, including language, right? And to give them up to live as other people here in the United States, there's a price tag with that too. It is not no cost choice. And so let everyone make the choices that they want, and you will see sort of a culture evolve, develop, where people in the United States will enjoy the new ideas that are brought from other countries, and the bad ones, the ones that really are not so successful here in this country of freedom, they get discarded, right? And some of them are much too expensive to maintain and perpetuate here in the United States. And I'm not talking about language anymore, right? It gets kind of complicated, but it's never the culture, right? So the whole cultural appropriation, or even, privileging culture as something above the law, or, all of that doesn't work, but I think I've discussed it before. I'll probably discuss it again in the future. So it's respect for freedom, property rights. And you start from there, and you let the pieces fall where they fall. And you will see generally the best practices become the most widely practiced behaviors, and it becomes part of culture. So everyone gets to choose which part of the culture they would like to retain, adopt, discard, whatever, and everyone will get along. And so, yeah, that might be. It's not easy. I understand that, but it is a way to get beyond a lot of the animosity that we see today. I'll talk to you guys next time.